Welcome back to Inside Vietnam. I'm glad you're here. Now, the title of this video asks a question. Is Vietnam still worth it? And I want to be straight with you from the start. I'm not going to answer that with a list of visa costs and average apartment rents. We've all seen those videos. You don't need another one from me. Instead, I want to introduce you to a man named Declan Murtagh. He's 54 years old, he's from Athlone in the Irish Midlands, and for 26 years, he was a secondary school teacher geography and history. The kind of teacher who actually knew his subject and cared that his students left the room knowing something they didn't when they walked in. By every measure that matters in a small Irish town, Declan was a solid, decent, grounded man. He was also, when he landed in Da Nang in February of last year, exactly the kind of person Vietnam can reach right down into. Not because he was reckless, not because he was foolish, but because of something much quieter than that. Something a lot of you watching this will recognize, even if you've never said it out loud. What happened to Declan over the 7 months that followed is going to stay with you. I'll tell you that now. This one's going to stick. Here's his story. In his own words, right. So, I should probably start by telling you what kind of person I am, because it matters to the story. I'm not the type who makes speeches about himself. In Roscommon, where I'm from originally, that sort of thing gets you looked at sideways. You keep your head down, you do your work, you're sound to people, and that's more or less the social contract. I understood that contract from about age 7, and I've more or less honored it ever since. I taught geography and history at the same school in Athlone for 26 years. Same staff room, same parking space by the end, not officially, but nobody took it. I had a mug with a chip in the handle that I used every single day because it was mine, and I knew where it was. That tells you something about me, I think. I'm not a man who needs variety. I'm a man who needs things to make sense. For a long time, they did. I married Sinaned in 1998. We bought a house outside Roscommon town. We had 2 kids, Ciaran, who's now 23, and Rosine, who's 20. I coached the junior hurling team for 6 years, which I was terrible at, but the boys liked me anyway. I ran the geography section of the Christmas table quiz at the parish hall every year, and I took it probably too seriously. I was, as they say in that part of the world, a sound man, which is not a compliment exactly, but it's not nothing either. It means people trust you and expect nothing dramatic from you, and for a long time, I thought that was enough. Then the marriage ended. I won't go into the detail of why, because the why is complicated in the way all marriages are complicated, and also because Sinead is not here to give her side of it, and I'm not interested in being unfair to her, even now. What I'll say is this. It took 3 years. 3 years of solicitors and mediation, and documents with her name on one side and my name on the other. 3 years of telling Ciaran and Rosine that their parents were managing it well, which was not entirely true. At the end of it, Sinead had the house, the car, and what felt irrationally, I know, like the benefit of the doubt from the children. And I had a 1-bedroom flat above a chipper on the Galway Road in Athlone, and a mug with a chip in the handle that I'd brought in a box, and Fridays that smelled like chip fat whether I was hungry or not. I kept teaching. That part was easy, actually, or not easy automatic. You put your coat on, you drive to school, you stand at the front of the room, and 32 15-year-olds require your attention whether you slept or not. In some ways, that rhythm was the only thing holding me together in that first year. The flat was very quiet. I'd been in a house with a family for 22 years, and then I was in a flat, alone, and the silence had a particular quality to it that I hadn't been prepared for. It wasn't peaceful silence. It was the silence of a stage set with no play running, everything in its place, nothing actually happening. I started watching YouTube late at night because sleep had become unreliable. This is how it started. Not dramatically, just a man in a flat, at midnight, holding his phone because the alternative was lying in the dark. I watched a lot of things. Documentaries, football analysis, cooking channels. And then, at some point, the algorithm did what algorithms do, and I started watching expat content. Cost of living videos, retirement abroad testimonials, men roughly my age, walking through markets in countries I'd taught on maps, saying things like fresh start, and I wish I'd done it sooner. One evening, I came across a video of a man from Wolverhampton. I never caught his name walking through a market in Da Nang. He was about my age, ordinary looking, a bit heavy around the middle, the kind of man you'd see at a garden center back home and not look at twice. And he was saying, to the camera, with complete and unaffected sincerity, Best decision I ever made. I watched it 4 times that night. What I was responding to, I can see this now, I couldn't see it then, wasn't the sunshine or the cheap beer or the cost of living figures he reeled off. It was the word unburdened. He used that word at one point, not in a dramatic way, just in passing. He said he felt unburdened, and I sat in my flat above the chipper, and I thought, that's it. That's the word for what I want. Not adventure, not a new life, not any of the things people say. Just to be somewhere that doesn't know the weight of what I've been carrying. I applied for unpaid leave from the school in January. I'd done it once before, in 2019, when my mother got sick and needed someone around. The deputy principal didn't ask many questions. I think she assumed it was something personal and didn't press it, which I appreciated. I told my sister Orla it was a sabbatical. Orla is 3 years younger than me and the most pragmatic person I've ever known. She asked 2 questions. Had I sorted my travel insurance, and was I after getting some class a breakdown? I told her I had and I wasn't. The first of those was true. I booked a one-way ticket, February 14th, which I noticed and chose to find funny rather than significant. I packed 2 bags. I've always traveled light. Another thing my marriage didn't change. I transferred money into an account I could access easily. 51,000 euro, give or take savings, a pension drawdown, and what my mother had left me when she passed in 2022. Not a fortune, not nothing. On the jet bridge at Dublin Airport, after I'd rung Orla to say I was boarding, and she'd said, "Mind yourself, Declan," in that tone she has that means I love you, but I'm worried, I had a thought, clear as anything. I thought, I spent 26 years teaching students the reasons civilizations collapse. Overextension. Wishful thinking. Ignoring the evidence in front of them because the alternative is too frightening to consider. And then I walked onto the plane. I want to be fair to the man I was when I landed, because it would be easy now that I know how the story ends to look back and see nothing but warning signs and bad omens. That wouldn't be honest. The truth is that the first 2 weeks in Da Nang were genuinely, straightforwardly good. Not good in a complicated way. Just good. And I think that matters to the story, because if it had been merely fine, I'd have gone home in March and none of the rest of it would have happened. The heat hit me first. February in Da Nang is not the ferocious summer heat. But after an Irish winter, the gray, the damp, the particular cold that gets into a flat above a chipper and stays there 24 degrees at 9 in the morning felt like being let out of something. I stood outside the airport with my 2 bags and I thought, right. All right then. I'd booked a guest house for the first week while I found somewhere permanent. Within 4 days, I had the apartment in Athlone. A clean place on the 4th floor, tiled floors, a ceiling fan, a small balcony looking out over the rooftops toward a sliver of sea if you stood at the right angle and craned slightly. 420 euro a month. I'd been paying 900 for the flat above the chipper. I texted Orla the monthly cost, and she sent back a single word. Seriously? I told her yes, seriously, and that I'd had a bowl of bon bihon for lunch that cost less than €1, and it was the best thing I'd eaten in 4 years. She sent back a thumbs up, which from Orla is practically a standing ovation. I want to describe what those first couple of weeks felt like, because I think it explains a lot. It wasn't happiness exactly. I wasn't sure I remembered what that felt like well enough to identify it on site. It was more like pressure releasing. The specific pressure of being somewhere that carried no history of you. Nobody in Da Nang knew I'd coached a hopeless junior hurling team for 6 years. Nobody knew about the solicitors, about Sinead, about the flat and the chip smell, and the mug with the chip in the handle. I was just a middle-aged Irish man in a light shirt, walking around a Vietnamese city with no particular agenda. That anonymity was worth considerably more to me than I'd have admitted to anyone at the time. I fell into a routine quickly, I always do. It's the teacher in me. Mornings I'd walk down to Tron Phu and find a coffee somewhere, watching the city get going around me. K for Trong, egg coffee, which sounds alarming and is in fact extraordinary. Then a walk sometimes down to Marquee Beach, sometimes inland through the market streets, where the produce was out on the footpaths and the noise was constant and rich. I hired a motorbike twice and got out to the Marble Mountains, which I found genuinely moving in the way that ancient things move. A person who has spent decades teaching about them on a whiteboard. I ate whatever was in front of me. I slept, slowly, and then better. I read in the evenings on the balcony. About 10 days in, I found the Expat Facebook group and, through it, a bar near the beach where Western men gathered on certain evenings. I want to be careful how I describe this, because I don't want to be uncharitable, but I also want to be honest. The men I met there were decent enough, friendly, in the way that people are friendly when they're all a long way from home and have that in common. But I noticed, fairly quickly, that there were types. The recently divorced who hadn't yet accepted that they were recently divorced. The retirees who'd come for 3 weeks and stayed 3 years without ever quite deciding to. The men who talked about Vietnamese women with a familiarity that made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't immediately name. I sat with a beer and I watched and I thought, I'm not that. Whatever this is, I'm not that. I was a teacher with a sabbatical and a genuine interest in the country. Completely different situation. I know. I know exactly what you're thinking. Stick with me. It was at this bar that I met Gary. Gary Hutchins, retired electrician from Brisbane, 4 years in Da Nang, and no apparent plans to leave. He was a compact, sun-weathered man in his early 60s who spoke in short declarative sentences and seemed to have no interest in performing contentment or misery for anyone's benefit. I liked him immediately, in the way you like someone who clearly doesn't need you to like them. We had a few beers. He gave me recommendations: a better market, a good mechanic if the motorbike needed anything, which faux place near Thong was actually good, rather than tourist good. Practical. No speeches. We exchanged numbers, and I walked home feeling that this was what settling in actually felt like. The coffee shop on Tren Phu I'd been using most mornings was a small place, locally run, the kind of spot with low plastic stools out front and a handwritten menu. I'd found it by accident in the first week and returned because the coffee was strong, and the owner's wife, who ran the morning shift, left you alone in a way that felt respectful rather than indifferent. I came in one morning. This was maybe 3 weeks after I'd arrived and sat down, and before I'd said anything, she brought my coffee. No sugar. The way I always had it. I hadn't been aware she was noting it. I said thank you, probably with some surprise showing on my face, and she nodded and went back behind the counter. I came back the following morning. Same thing. Coffee arrived. No sugar, no question asked. And then she came to clear the cup, and she paused and said, in careful, deliberate English, "Are you a teacher?" I asked her how she could possibly know that. She considered this for a moment, the way someone does when they're translating not just language but explanation. Then she said something about how I held myself, the way I sat like I was waiting for something to require my attention. She'd learned some of her English from teachers, she said. She could recognize the posture. Her name was Lynn. I talked for 40 minutes. She listened with the particular quality of attention that is actually quite rare, not waiting for her turn, not distracted, just present with whatever you're saying. She told me a little about herself in return. She was 34. She taught herself English from Korean dramas and YouTube channels. She worked at this coffee shop for 3 years and was saving for something she left vague. She was not flirtatious. She was not performing warmth. She was just a person, having a conversation, in the morning, over coffee. When I left, I tipped 200,000 dong, about €8. Extravagant for a cup of coffee because I felt self-conscious about how much I'd talked and couldn't think of another way to express it. I walked back to the apartment and I thought about the conversation more than I meant to, not in an alarming way. Just in a way you think about something that surprised you. Someone had looked at me and read something true. In Athlone, in the final years, I'd sometimes felt like a piece of furniture that everyone had long since stopped noticing. Here was a 34-year-old Vietnamese woman who'd looked at me for 30 seconds and said, "You're a teacher, aren't you?" It was a small thing. I'm aware of how small it was. But I want you to understand something about the man sitting on that balcony that evening, watching the lights come on across the Da Nang rooftops. He was 54 years old. He had been quietly invisible for the better part of 4 years, and someone had seen him. That is where the story actually starts. Let me be precise about how it happened, because the precision matters. People hear a story like mine, and they imagine a seduction, some deliberate, calculated campaign. That's not what this was. Or, if it was the most patient and carefully constructed version of it I've ever encountered. And I've spent 26 years watching teenagers attempt to manipulate their way out of homework. I like to think I know the difference. The day after the 40-minute conversation, Lynn sent me a text, just a message, in her careful English, saying there was a market near the Siamla Bridge that was much better than the tourist one near the beach. Cheaper, more real, she said. Did I know it? I didn't. She offered to show me, one morning before her shift, if I was interested. That was it. That was the whole text. No suggestion of anything beyond a market visit. I went. We walked it together for an hour. She knew every stall, every vendor, the particular woman who sold the best raw muyung, where to get lemongrass that hadn't been sitting out since Tuesday. She haggled for me in Vietnamese when I wanted dragon fruit, and then looked mildly appalled at the price I'd been about to pay, which I found funny and also instructive. I bought too much and carried it home in a bag she'd thought to bring. She went to work. I made myself breakfast on the small gas hob in the apartment, and I thought, this is fine. This is just two people being friendly. 2 days later, she texted again. My phone plan, she'd noticed, was a tourist SIM expensive for data. There was a Viatel shop on Hung Vi Yun that would sort me out for about a quarter of the cost. I went. She met me there on her lunch break, explained everything to the man behind the counter, and was back at work within 20 minutes. She refused the coffee I offered to buy her, said she didn't have time. I want you to notice that last detail. She refused things. Repeatedly, in those early weeks, she refused things. I offered to pay for lunch after the market. She said no. She had food at the coffee shop. I offered a taxi when it started raining one evening. She said she had her motorbike. It was fine. The refusals were always warm, never sharp, and they consistently wrong-footed me in a way that, I understand now, was probably the point. But at the time, they simply felt like evidence of character. The dinner was her suggestion, which I also noted and filed as evidence. A place in the Huishao district, no English menu, plastic chairs, fluorescent lighting, the kind of place you'd walk past 100 times and never enter without guidance. She ordered for both of us, without asking if I had preferences, which in Ireland might have felt presumptuous, and here felt like exactly the right thing. We had bun me'em and something I still couldn't name if you asked me, and cold bottles of LaRue beer, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not romance, not exactly, not yet. Something quieter. I felt present, like I was actually in the room I was sitting in, rather than mentally somewhere else processing something from 3 years ago. I paid. Of course I paid. She made a gesture toward her bag, and I said, "Don't be ridiculous." And she said thank you with a directness that didn't make it feel like either charity received or transaction completed. I walked home, and I thought, right, all right. Within a month, we were seeing each other most evenings. She would finish her shift. She started early and was done by 2, and we would meet somewhere. A walk along the Han River in the late afternoon when the heat softened. A coffee somewhere different from her workplace, because she said she didn't want to bring her 2 lives into the same room, which seemed reasonable. Occasional dinners. She was teaching me Vietnamese phrases, a few words at a time, and she laughed at my pronunciation, not unkindly. The way you laugh at a child who's making a genuine effort and getting it comprehensively wrong. I mispronounced Shinkao for 2 weeks before she finally took my phone and made me listen to a recording of the correct version on a loop. I should tell you about the Xi'an weekend, because it was the moment I stopped lying to myself about what this was. I suggested it. That matters. It was my idea entirely, not hers. I'd wanted to see Hue properly, and I asked if she'd like to come for 2 nights. She was quiet for a moment and then said yes. I booked 2 rooms, separate rooms, which I did without discussion, and she didn't acknowledge either way. We took a grab car down on a Saturday morning and spent 2 days walking the lantern-lit streets, eating kaolu and white rose dumplings, taking a boat on the Thubian River at sunset. She was warm, attentive, interested in everything, not performing delight for my benefit, but genuinely curious, pointing things out I'd have walked past. She told me about her childhood, a little. Her mother was from Qingnam province originally. Her father had left when she and her brother were small. She said this without asking for sympathy, just as information, the way she gave most things. The total cost of the weekend rooms, food, transport, a few small things I bought her, a scarf she admired and then said she didn't need, I bought it anyway, came to about €400. I'm telling you the number because numbers matter in this story, and I want you to have all of them. It didn't feel like spending. It felt like living, which is a distinction that made considerable sense to me at the time and looks considerably thinner in retrospect. On the drive back to Da Nang, she fell asleep against the car window, and I sat beside her in the dark and thought, I haven't been this happy in years, which should perhaps have prompted a harder question about what exactly I was happy about and why, and whether happiness that arrives this quickly from this direction ought to be trusted. But the man in that car was not asking hard questions. He was just happy, for the first time in 4 years. And the relief of it was so enormous that he was not going to interrogate it until much later. It was around week 8 that she introduced me to her mother. The family home was in a narrow lane off Nguyenvi, and Lynn a 2-story house, neat and modest, a small shrine near the door, a television running in the corner. Her mother was a small, precise woman in her 60s who had come from Queen Nam years ago and brought its particular quality of seriousness with her. She fed me bonziro, the sizzling pancakes filled with prawns and bean sprouts that you wrap in rice paper and dip, and watched me eat with an expression I read as warmth. I've thought about that expression a great deal since. I've revised my reading of it. Lynn's younger brother was there too, 19 years old, mostly horizontal on a motorbike seat out the back when we arrived, then briefly vertical to be introduced, then back on his phone in the corner of the room. Min. I remember thinking he seemed like every 19-year-old boy I'd ever taught, inhabiting the general vague vicinity of the family home without being particularly engaged with it. I noted him as a detail in the way you note details that don't yet mean anything. He'll come back into this story shortly. Now, I mentioned I'd read the expat forums before I came, and in those first weeks, I'd read enough to know the general shape of the cautionary tale. Older Western man, younger Vietnamese woman, money moving in one direction, eventual devastation. I was not unaware of this narrative. I want to be absolutely clear about that, because it would be easier for me if I could claim ignorance, and I can't. I knew the template. About 2 weeks after the Hawaiian trip, I had a beer with Gary and mentioned Lynn. I described her the way I've just described her to you. The careful English, the coffee shop, the market, the way she refused things, the separate rooms in Heian. Gary listened without interrupting, which wasn't his normal habit, and when I'd finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "How long has it been?" "About 6 weeks," I told him. He nodded slowly. Didn't say anything immediately. Then he said, "Yeah, they're always good for the first couple of months." I told him, patiently and with the full conviction of a man who has just assembled an airtight case, that I understood what he was implying and that this was different. That Lynn was not what he was picturing. That she'd refused money, refused gifts, suggested nothing. That the forum stories were about a very specific kind of dynamic that simply wasn't present here. I was not some lonely man being played. I was a person, having a genuine connection with another person, in a city where I happened to be living. That happened to people. It was allowed to happen. Gary looked at his beer and said, "Yeah, mate, you're probably right." He didn't say it like he thought I was right. He said it like a man who has had this exact conversation before and has learned which battles are worth it. 3 days later, Lynn called me in the early evening. Her voice was different, quieter, careful. Her brother had been in a motorbike accident. Not serious. He was fine, physically, but the bike was damaged and needed repair. The family didn't have the money right now. She was so sorry to ask. She would pay me back as soon as she could. Her exact words were, "I feel very bad to say this to you. The repair cost €350, about 8.5 million dong." I transferred it to her account within the hour. I want to tell you what I thought when I hung up that phone. I thought, this is what it means to help someone you care about. That's all. I thought of how much 350 had shrunk in meaning over the previous weeks. It was less than one of my old monthly electricity bills, less than a car service, less than 2 months of the flat above the chipper over what I was paying here. I thought that in a country with a median monthly wage of under €300, a motorbike repair was not a small thing. I thought that Sinaned had cost me considerably more than this and had never once said she felt bad about asking. I did not think, here we go. I should have thought, here we go. Here's something I've thought about a great deal since. The distance between each request was always just long enough. Not so long that I forgot the last one, but long enough that when the next one arrived, it felt like a new event rather than a continuation of something. The motorbike repair was late April. The next thing was mid-May. 3 weeks in between, during which Lynn and I continued seeing each other most evenings, during which nothing was mentioned, during which she was, and I want to be precise here, no warmer than usual. That's important. There was no sudden surge of affection after the money, no obvious reward. Things were just as they had been, which, I understand now, was itself a technique, whether conscious or not. If there had been a noticeable increase in warmth, I might have registered the transaction. Instead, there was continuity, and continuity felt like proof that the transaction hadn't mattered, that we were simply people, and sometimes people helped each other. Mid-May, her mother's pharmacy bill. The mother had a chronic condition, something with her joints, Lynn said. She'd been managing it for years, and the monthly medication was expensive. The pharmacy required payment up front, and the timing was difficult that month. Could Declan help? She would sort it out next month. Her exact words were, "It is not so much money for you, but for us it is big." I've written down the amounts because I want you to hear them the way I experience them, not as a lump sum, but one at a time. The pharmacy bill was €420, about 10 million dong. I transferred it that evening. Then June, a rent shortfall. The family home they rented, the house on the lane off Nguyen, the Cien Lynn, the landlord had increased the rent, and the increase had caught the mothers short. €600, 14.5 million dong. The landlord was not patient, Lynn said. He'd already asked twice. I paid it. I want to describe my internal accounting at this point, because it's instructive. In my head, I was not tallying these up as a running total. I was treating each one as a discrete event, a specific problem with a specific solution. The motorbike, the pharmacy, the rent. If you'd asked me in late June how much I'd given Lynn's family, I'd have had to sit and add it up, which I was not doing, and the sum by that point somewhere around €4,500, including the high-end weekend and the dinners and various smaller things, would not have alarmed me even if I had added it up. It was 9% of what I'd arrived with. It was less than a month's salary back home after tax. Vietnam was simply a different economic reality, and I was a person with more money than the people around me, and helping was what you did. This is what I told myself. There was a conversation with Gary in early June that I think about differently now than I did at the time. We were at the bar near the beach, 2 beers in, and I told him about the pharmacy bill in the way you tell a friend an anecdote rather than a confession. Gary didn't react immediately. He finished a mouthful of beer and then said, quite simply and without particular emphasis, "Mate, the family emergencies don't stop. They just get bigger." I told him I didn't think that was necessarily true, that every family had difficult months, that it would be condescending to assume that needing help occasionally was inherently suspicious rather than just life. Gary said, "Yeah, sure." Again with that tone, the tone of a man conserving energy. Looking back now, Gary said everything he needed to say in those 2 exchanges. The problem was that I heard the words and processed them as Gary's generalized cynicism, rather than as information specifically relevant to my situation. I had constructed a very solid mental partition between what happened to other men and what was happening to me, and that partition did not come down cheaply. There was also the other thing, the thing I was noting and not examining. She never stayed at the apartment. From the very beginning, she was always gone by 10, sometimes by 9. The reasons were always domestic. Her mother needed her. She had an early shift. She had something in the morning. The reasons were always warm and slightly apologetic and entirely plausible, taken individually. I had told myself, and largely believed, that this was a cultural matter. That Vietnamese women of her background and generation maintained separation between a relationship and a family home, and that this was not evasion but propriety, and that I respected it. And there was this, twice, in May and June, I was with her when her phone rang and she looked at the screen and her face changed a fraction, barely detectable, and she said, "Excuse me," and stepped outside to take the call. Both times, she came back within a few minutes, composed, with a brief explanation. "Work," she said once. "A friend with a problem," the other time. Both times I watched and noted, and added the observation to the ledger of things I was not yet reading. I am a teacher. I've spent 26 years reading rooms, reading faces, identifying the student who hasn't done the work and knows they haven't done it, and is deploying every available distraction. I was not unobservant. I want that on the record. I saw the phone calls. I registered the departures. I kept the ledger. I simply did not open it, because what was on the other side of opening it? The possibility that the 7 weeks of markets and dinners in Xi'an and the Mother's Bond Shio, and the feeling of being present in a room and seen by another person, what was on the other side of looking at that, honestly, was something I did not have the resources to face. So I kept the ledger closed, and I told myself I was being culturally sensitive, and I transferred the money when it was needed. In late June, there was a hospital consultation. Something cardiac, the mother had been having some breathlessness, and the local doctor had referred her for a specialist assessment. Nothing alarming at this stage, just thorough, Lynn said. The consultation cost €780, 19 million dong. I paid it. The total by the end of June was approximately €5,000, counting everything from the beginning. I had 46,000 remaining. I was 3.5 months into my sabbatical, and I was, in most measurable ways, still considerably better off than I had been in Athlone. This is what I focused on. It was a Wednesday evening in late June, sitting at a table outside a Com Tam place on Laduan broken rice with grilled pork and a fried egg. which I had been eating approximately 3 times a week and still looked forward to when Lynn said something that broke a pattern I hadn't consciously identified until it broke. She had never brought anything to me before. She had texted, she had suggested, she had asked when she needed to ask, but she had never arrived at something with the shape of an opportunity. She said it carefully, as she said most things. A cousin of hers, she mentioned him in passing, as context rather than introduction, had some information about a business situation that Declan might find interesting. Not a proposal, just information. She said there was no pressure. She wasn't sure if it was the kind of thing he would care about. But the cousin had mentioned it, and she'd thought she would pass it along, since Declan had said once or twice that he'd been thinking about whether there was a way to build something here. I had said that. In April, on the Han River walk, I'd said something about how the sabbatical was working well enough that I'd been wondering if there was a way to make the stay more permanent, more purposeful. I'd said it the way you say things on evening walks, half idea, half reverie. She had listened and said something thoughtful, and the conversation had moved on. She had remembered. I told her yes. I'd be happy to hear about it. And I thought, this is what it looks like when someone is invested in your future. When they're listening to what you say and thinking about how to help. When it goes in both directions. I thought that, and I meant it, and I was wrong about it in almost every particular. But that comes next. The restaurant the cousin chose was on Ungo Kien, near the river. The kind of place with cloth napkins and a wine list, considerably nicer than anywhere Lynn and I had eaten together. I noticed that. I noticed it, and I interpreted it as a sign of seriousness, of professional intent, which tells you something about where my head was by early July. His name was Fong. He was in his early 40s, well-built, a fitted shirt, a gold watch on his left wrist that caught the light when he gestured, and he gestured frequently. His English was confident rather than fluent, certain words chosen carefully, the accent carrying weight in a way that projected authority. He shook my hand with both of his and said it was very good to meet Lynn's friend, that she had spoken highly of me, that he hoped the evening would be useful for everyone. He had a folder. Actual printed documents, which I mentioned because it mattered to me at the time as evidence of legitimacy. Inside, photographs of a small guest house on the southwestern outskirts of Da Nang, a property that had been operating pre-COVID and had not fully recovered since. Occupancy figures from 2019 strong, and from 2022 and 2023, weak but improving. A projected recovery curve, a partnership structure in which an outside investor would take a minority stake, the day-to-day operation remaining with the existing management. Return projections over 3 years. I looked at these documents. I asked questions. Bong answered them fluently and warmly. Lynn sat beside me and said very little, which I took as appropriately modest rather than strategically distant. After dinner, I told Fong I'd like to see the property. He said, of course. Absolutely. He'd arrange it. 2 days later, I took a grab to the address. There was a guest house. This is the part one, find most difficult to explain to people, because they assume the whole thing was fabricated from nothing. A fiction, a ghost address. It wasn't. There was a real building, a sign in Vietnamese and rough English, a reception desk of dark wood, a woman sitting behind it who looked up when I came in and smiled. I asked, in my broken Vietnamese and her broken English, whether I could look around. She gestured welcomingly. I walked through, 6 rooms I could see, clean, a small courtyard out the back, a breakfast table. Real, solid. Standing there in the afternoon heat of a Da Nang suburb, I thought, this is a real thing. I can see it. I checked the address against what Fong had shown me. It matched. I did not hire a lawyer. I want to be plain about this, because it is the central failure, and I own it completely. I had the name of an English-speaking Vietnamese legal firm from an expat forum. Someone had posted it in the Facebook group months earlier as a resource. I did not contact them. I told myself that people who consulted lawyers for every decision were the kind of people who never did anything, which is a thought I now recognize as the rationalization of a man who knew, at some level, that scrutiny would not help his case. I transferred the first €7,000 in the second week of July. The second 7,000, completing the 14,000 total, 3 weeks after that. Fong sent acknowledgments each time, professional, brief, mentioning next steps around the permit application, which was the formal stage currently being processed. I told Orla I'd made a small investment in a local business. She replied with a voice note rather than a text, which meant she was either pleased or concerned with Orla. It's hard to tell until the sentence finishes. She said it sounded interesting and to make sure I had something in writing. I told her I had documents. I did not specify what kind. For about 2 weeks after the second transfer, I felt something I can only describe as settled. The sabbatical had a shape now. I wasn't just living here, I was building something. There was a version of the story I could tell Ciaran and Rawazin when the time came. That wasn't just their father having a breakdown in Southeast Asia. It was their father making a considered decision to put down roots somewhere new, to invest in a future that made sense. The word sabbatical could graduate into something more dignified. Then the permits became complicated. Fong messaged in mid-August to say there was a delay in the application. A documentation issue with the local authority, nothing unusual. These things took time. He was sorry for the inconvenience. He would update me as soon as there was news. I messaged back saying I understood, no problem. Please do keep me informed. He messaged 10 days later. Still processing, the relevant office was slow. He was following up. I thanked him. Then a gap of 2 weeks. I sent a message. He replied within a day, progress was being made. He expected resolution within the month. I thanked him again and put the phone down. Meanwhile, and I say meanwhile because that is the word that keeps coming back to me when I go over the timeline. Meanwhile, Lynn's mother had become seriously ill, not the chronic joint condition, something new, or something that had been chronic and had escalated, a cardiac event, hospitalization, a specialist at a private facility in Da Nang. The public hospital was fine, Lynn said, but the specialist her mother needed had a private practice. I have since read enough about the Vietnamese healthcare system to understand that this is a real and common situation, not a fabrication. Private specialists exist and are expensive, and people do sometimes need them. I knew this at the time too. I knew it, and it provided another layer of reasonable explanation for what I was being asked. The first hospital payment was €2,000, 48.5 million dong. I paid it in the first week of August, then a follow-up consultation, €2,500. Then, 6 weeks after the initial hospitalization, a final payment described as covering ongoing medication and a home care arrangement, €2,000, €6,500 in total, in 3 separate tranches, each one arriving with Lynn's familiar register of reluctance and apology and quiet distress, and each one met by my familiar register of measured generosity and quiet dread that I was managing by not fully acknowledging it existed. I will tell you now what I told no one then. I knew. Somewhere below the level at which I was operating, I knew. Not the full picture, I didn't know the specific shape of the thing. But I knew that I was holding approximately €25,000 less than I'd had in February, and that the investment was stalled, and that the gaps between Fong's messages were lengthening, and that I was sitting on a balcony in An Thung watching the Da Nang skyline and feeling the thing I had felt in the last 2 years of my marriage. The particular cognitive exhaustion of a man who is managing anxiety by refusing to look directly at its source. In my marriage, the source had been the knowledge that it was ending. I had managed that for 2 years by staying busy, by marking papers at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, by investing enormous energy in the geography quiz at the Christmas table quiz, by doing anything that required my attention and wasn't the conversation I needed to have with Sinead. I got very good at that skill. It turns out skills transfer. I sent Fong another message in the second week of September. The reply came after 4 days. The permits required an additional supporting document from a historical planning record, something his contact at the authority was sourcing. He was confident. He appreciated my patience. I replied, "Thanks, let me know." I put the phone face down on the balcony table, and I looked out at the city and I thought, I am concerned. I am not panicking. I am concerned. There is a significant difference. There wasn't really. But I wasn't ready yet to close the distance between those two words, because closing it meant opening the ledger, and I still wasn't ready for what was in there. That readiness came from outside me, on an unremarkable Tuesday in September, in the form of a message from Gary. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was at the apartment, sitting at the small table near the balcony door with a cup of tea and a paperback history of the Mekong Delta I'd bought at a second-hand stall near the market. The balcony door was open, and the street noise was coming up motorbikes, a vendor somewhere below calling out, the particular mid-afternoon hum that Da Nang makes when the heat is at its peak, and the city slows slightly before picking back up. I remember these details because I've gone over them many times since, the way you replay the minutes before an accident. My phone buzzed. Gary, not a call, a message. The message said, "Hey mate, Thought you should probably see this. Sorry if you already know. Below it, a screenshot. A Facebook profile, semi-public, belonging to a Vietnamese man in his late 30s. The profile photo showed him smiling at someone off camera, a relaxed, domestic sort of smile. His name was Nguyen Vinh Ting. Below the profile photo, Gary had screenshot a tagged photo from what looked like a family event. A room with colored lights, a table with food, people dressed for something formal. And Lynn, in the center of the frame, wearing an áo dai, the red and gold one she'd told me in August was for a cousin's wedding. An event she'd attended on a Saturday when I hadn't seen her. In the photo, she was standing beside Nguyen Vinh Tung. His hand was on her waist. The tag below his name said Chiun husband. In a separate photo further down the same profile, a child. A boy, small, perhaps 3 years old, at a table with food in front of him, looking at the camera with the focused seriousness of very small children. The timestamp on the photo was from 14 months earlier. I put the phone down on the table. Then I picked it up and looked at it again, because I think some part of me believed that looking a second time would produce a different result. It did not. I am Irish. We do not process catastrophic news by reacting to it immediately. We process it by making tea, which is not as irrational as it sounds. The ritual of standing up, filling the kettle, finding a cup, performing a series of small actions that require just enough attention to prevent total stillness, gives the mind time to begin doing something with what it has just received. I made tea. I did not even particularly want tea. I stood in the small kitchen of the An Thang apartment, and I boiled the kettle, and I poured it, and I brought the cup back to the table, and I sat with it, and I looked out at the afternoon, and I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, of course, not the specifics. The specifics came later and were worse than this first recognition. But the recognition itself that the careful, attentive, unhurried architecture of the previous 7 months had been assembled around a central fact that was not what I'd understood it to be that arrived, in that moment, with the flat completeness of something that has been true for a long time and is only now being acknowledged. I spent several hours going back through our WhatsApp history. This is not a dignified activity, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. A 54-year-old man in a Da Nang apartment, scrolling backward through 7 months of messages with a cup of cold tea, looking for the inconsistencies that had always been there and that I was now, finally, equipped to see. They were not subtle. The unreachable days, which now had an obvious explanation. The evening she left early, which now had an obvious explanation. The cousin's wedding she'd attended alone. The phone calls taken outside. I messaged her that evening. Not a confrontation by text. I'm not that sort. I asked her to come to the apartment the following afternoon. I told her I wanted to talk. She said, of course. Was everything all right? I said yes, just wanted to talk. She said she'd be there at 2. She arrived at 2. She came in and sat down and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not the composure I knew, but something beneath it, a calculation. I think she already knew. I think she had already been through her own version of the previous evening, considering what I might know and what she might need to manage. I showed her the screenshot. She didn't deny it immediately. She did what I had watched students do my entire career. When confronted with something undeniable, she looked for the version that could be survived. She said the marriage was in name only, that Thung and she had been separated in every real way for 2 years. That in Vietnam, divorce was complicated. Complicated in ways that were legal, familial, social, all at once, and that the word estranged carried different weight here than it might elsewhere. She had wanted to tell me. She had not known how. She was sorry. Her exact words were, I did not want to lose what we have. I listened to this. I let her finish. And then I asked about the child. She said the child was complicated. I asked about Phong. And here the composure shifted, only slightly. But I had been watching faces for 26 years, and I did not miss it. She said that Phong was someone she knew. An acquaintance, a person from a network she declined to describe in detail. She had made an introduction. She had thought it might be a real opportunity for me. She had not known, she said, the full arrangement. I sat with that for a moment. She watched me. I said, you knew enough. She didn't answer. And in the silence that followed, the particular silence of someone who has nothing left to manage the situation with, I understood the full picture. Not in the sense of understanding every specific detail, but in the way you understand the shape of something, even when the details are still unclear. The 14,000 in the guest house. The 6,500 in hospital payments. The courtship cost before that. The motorbike repair, the pharmacy bill, the rent, all of it. 25,500 euro. Assembled piece by piece over 7 months with a patience and a precision that I, a man who had spent his career assessing the quality of other people's work, found myself genuinely unable to regard as anything other than extraordinary. The thing I felt was not rage. This surprised me too when I noticed it. I had expected to feel rage, and I didn't. What I felt was something quieter and more lasting, the specific variety of humiliation that comes not from being deceived, but from being read. She had seen something in me, the invisible man, the Athlone geography teacher who'd been undone by 3 years of legal process and was sitting alone at midnight watching YouTube. And she had understood it more accurately than I had understood it myself. She had been more observant than I was, more patient, more precise. I had spent 7 months thinking I was reading the room. The room had been reading me. I said she should go. She left without raising her voice. The door closed quietly. I sat in the apartment for a long time. At about 9 that evening, I messaged Gary. I said, "You were right." He replied within a minute. He said, "Mate, I'm sorry. Genuinely. You all right?" I told him I was fine. He said, "Yeah." He didn't say anything else for a moment, and then he said, "Come for a beer when you're ready." I said I would. He didn't say "I told you so." I want that on the record. Whatever else Gary did not say "I told you so." I am from a part of the world where restraint of that kind is considered the highest form of decency, and I have not forgotten it. People always ask why I didn't go straight home. It's usually the first question when I tell this story, and I understand why the natural narrative logic says, disaster occurs, man retreats, story ends. But I want to explain why that wasn't what happened, and I want to explain it honestly rather than making it sound more considered than it was. There was nothing in Athlone that had changed. That's the simple version. The flat above the chipper was still there. The smell of it was still there. The school was technically still holding my position. My leave didn't expire until the end of November. Going home in September, arriving broken and 2 months early, would have required me to explain myself to people I had no interest in explaining myself to. Orla would have been kind, and I couldn't have borne it. My colleagues would have been carefully and curious, and I couldn't have borne that either. There is a specific Irish pride, not glamorous, not particularly admirable, just deeply ingrained, that says you do not come home from a thing until you can come home from it standing up. I wasn't standing up yet, so I stayed. I moved out of the Athlone apartment within a week. The neighborhood had accumulated too much weight every street near it. It was a route I'd walked with Lynn. Every coffee shop on Trin Fu was a version of the same morning. I found a smaller, cheaper place in Sintra, closer to the peninsula, further from everything the previous 7 months had built around itself. The new apartment cost €280 a month. I noted the saving without feeling anything in particular about it. I also consulted a lawyer, an English-speaking Vietnamese firm, the one that had been posted in the Expat Facebook group months earlier, the one I had not contacted before putting €14,000 into a partnership I had not properly examined. The lawyer was a composed, efficient woman in her 40s who listened to my account of the guest house arrangement with the expression of someone hearing a familiar story. She explained, without unkindness, that the structure of the arrangement, the informality of the documents, the absence of registered company details, the involvement of a man I could no longer locate made recovery possible in principle and impractical in reality. She said, "You could pursue this, but it would cost you significantly, take a very long time, and the probability of recovering a meaningful amount is low." I paid her consultation fee. I did not pursue it further. She was the only person in Vietnam who gave me purely honest professional advice, and I wish I had met her in June. The 2 months in Sintra were the most genuinely solitary of my life. I want to make a distinction here, because the flat above the chipper in Athlone had also been solitary, and people might assume these are the same. They weren't. In Athlone, the solitude was a wound being ignored. In Da Nang, after everything, it was a wound being looked at. I walked to my key beach in the mornings, early, before the heat built, the South China Sea flat and pale at that hour. I ate alone. I read history, always history, because it is the only subject I know that makes human foolishness feel structural rather than personal, which is a comfort I have relied on my entire career. And I thought about Sinayad, not bitterly, the way I had thought about her in the flat above the chipper, differently, with a recognition I hadn't been ready for before, that what I had looked for in Da Nang, the being seen, the presence, the replacement of the weight that had been removed, was not something I had processed and moved through after the divorce. It was something I had simply carried onto a plane and carried into a coffee shop on Tron Phu, still unexamined, still looking for somewhere to land. That recognition didn't feel good, but it felt true, which was more useful. I called Orla in late October. Late Irish time, early morning mine, the Swan Try apartment dark and quiet. I told her some of it. Not all. I told her there had been a situation involving a woman and some money, and it hadn't ended well, and I was coming home in November as planned. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How much?" I told her. She was quiet again, longer this time. Then she said, "You're all right, though. Not a question." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good. Come home." She didn't interrogate me. She didn't say "I told you so" either, though she'd asked about a breakdown on the jet bridge and had been right. This is why Orla is the sister I call. The night before my flight, I sat in the Swantraw apartment with my phone propped against the wall, and I recorded a video. Not for this channel, just for myself. The city noise was coming through the window, motorbikes, a distant karaoke bar somewhere down the hill, going through something slow and heartfelt in Vietnamese, the low general murmur of a city at 11 at night. I talked for about 20 minutes. I said everything: the coffee shop, the markets, Huian, Phong, the guest house, the Tuesday afternoon, all of it. Plainly, in order, the way you give evidence. I still have the video on my phone. I have never watched it back. I don't think I need to. I know what it says. I landed at Dublin Airport on the 23rd of November. The cold hit me like a door closing. I got a taxi to Athlone. The flat was exactly as I had left it. The chip smell. The chip smell. The reliable chip smell. I unpacked my 2 bags. I made tea using actual berries tea, which I had missed more than I expected, and I sat in the same chair I had sat in the night I watched the Wolverhampton man's video, and I thought, right, all right then. I went back to the school in January. My leave expired on the 31st of December, and I returned on the 2nd of January, and nothing was said and nothing was asked. A colleague called Malachi said the students had been giving my substitute trouble with the junior cert material. I said I'd sort it, and I did. That is how Athlone works, and I have always understood Athlone, and there is something in that understanding that I am grateful for, even now. Sierra and Rosine know none of this. They were distant before I left, and they are distant still, and that is a longer project than a sabbatical, as I have said to myself many times. I am working on it with the patience of a man who has recently been given an extended lesson in what patience is actually for. Now, the lesson. I want to be careful with this, because I've watched enough of these videos to know that the lesson usually gets delivered as a warning against a place or a people, and I refuse to do that. Da Nang is a real city. The warmth of it is real. The life available there is genuinely good, if you go for the right reasons. Gary is still there, 4 years and counting, and his life is fine. The thing that happened to me did not happen because of Vietnam. It happened because of what I brought to Vietnam. Loneliness is not a travel document. I want to say that clearly, because it is the most honest thing I know how to offer from this. You cannot board a flight out of grief and land somewhere healed. Whatever you are when you leave is precisely what you carry into every room you walk into, every coffee shop, every conversation, every moment when someone with sufficient patience and precision makes you feel seen. I was a man with a wound I had not looked at. I was, therefore, a man who was vulnerable in ways I could not have identified because I wasn't looking at them. And I arrived in a city where someone could see that wound more clearly than I could, and she used it. And it cost me €25,500 in 7 months, and every cent of what my mother left me. That last part 1, mentioned last and most quietly, because it is the part that cost me most to say. The French didn't tell anyone what happened at Sien Bien Phu. They absorbed the humiliation privately, and the Americans arrived in Vietnam a decade later, having learned essentially nothing from it. And you know how that ended. I'm a history teacher. The reason you document the failure is so the next person through doesn't repeat it. That's all. That is the only professional instinct I have left fully operational. And it is why I agreed to tell this story here, rather than keeping it on my phone in an unwatched video. That's Declan Murtagh, 54 years old, from County Roscommon, back in his classroom in Athlone. And that's where I'll leave you today on Inside Vietnam. Declan's story is not an unusual one in its outline. Older Western man, financial loss, a relationship that was not what it appeared. But what makes it worth sitting with, I think, is the honesty with which he tells it. Not a victim's account, not a warning against a country or its people. Just a clear-eyed portrait of a specific kind of vulnerability that a lot of men carry and very few examine until something forces them to. The title of this video asks whether Vietnam is still worth it. I think Declan's answer, and mine, is the same. It depends entirely on what you're bringing with you. If you're coming with clear eyes and solid foundations and a genuine interest in building a life here, Vietnam is extraordinary. If you're coming with an unexamined wound, dressed up as an adventure, then no destination is worth that, and Vietnam will simply be where it happened to you. If anything in Declan's story resonated with you, if you've been through something similar, or you're currently somewhere in the middle of it, drop it in the comments. Every story shared is one fewer person who has to learn the same thing, the expensive way. There are more stories coming. There always are. This has been Inside Vietnam. Take care of yourselves out there.